Welcome to Issues That Matter. I'm Cynthia Pooler. My guests today are my friends Dennis Speed and Diane Sare, and we're going to talk about hyperinflation and war. But before we get started about talking like that, I want a small overview of what you guys thought about Zelensky coming to the Congress yesterday and pleading for more money. Diane?
Well, I was glad that he and Pelosi remained clothed and their affectionate embrace. The thing was disgusting. He had clearly a carefully crafted speech, which he couldn't have believed because Ukraine is not winning and because the loss of life in his country is horrific and the people are suffering terribly. So all of this about a victory in your mind was really, I found, quite bizarre. But worse to me was the behavior of the US Congress, where everything is an act and to appear a certain way in front of the people who give you money, and also sitting there snidely or what, I don't know, not even snide, just it doesn't seem to affect them that millions of people on the planet, if not billions of people, are suffering because of their policy. They're totally oblivious and they're happy about the money they can make from their military industrial complex investments. And I think it's a travesty. And I think most of anyone who went to that assembly and applauded or gave a standing ovation for Zelensky should be run out of town on a post.
Dennis, what was your impression?
Well, I liked his suit. Oh, he didn't have one. That's right.
Right.
Well, let's put it this way. There is a term that is sometimes used by fundraisers. It's called a special. It's obvious that Zelensky's purpose was to secure a $45 billion special from the Congress. He has kept his people in Bakhmut, and many people, Colonel McGregor, Scott Ritter, Alex Mercoris from Duran, they're all saying, why is he doing this? They can't possibly win. The Russians are steadily advancing in that territory. So why does he continue to throw these hundreds and thousands of troops into this breach where they're just going to get chewed up? Well, people got their answer last night. If you consider that the total budget of Ukraine in 2021 was $48 billion, and that as of now, as of December, the United States has sent $68 billion already this year. So this tells you, okay, why he would be there. It's an interesting thing, Cynthia, since we're about to talk about hyperinflation. You know that the total military budget, the official military budget of the United States in 1969 was $85 billion. Now that's the size of the present Russian military budget for 2023. In other words, that's how much the Russians, after their whole mobilization, it's going to be $85 billion. The total budget this year for the United States, military budget, official budget, not the black budget, not special interest money, $858 billion. It's 10 times the size of 1969. Okay. So we want to talk about hyperinflation. There's an example that can start off the discussion, because ask yourself, are you getting even more, as much for your money now after all of, just look at the absurdity of it. That was when we equipped our own army. That's when we were also what? This was after the Second World War. We were clearly the dominant industrial power in the world. How is it possible now that you have this $858 billion official budget? How is it possible? There's no Russia, there's no Soviet Union, right? We had that time because we're fighting against the Soviet Union, we're fighting against communism. We must make that sacrifice. And of course, people then argued about it. You had Americans discussing it. You had them debating it. You had them marching about it. Now, in a situation where there is no Soviet Union, and Russia is spending a tenth. They're spending what we spent in 1969, but they're the great threat. So I think that's kind of a good place to sort of start this whole discussion.
Okay, so the discussion is hyperinflation and more. And Dennis, you kind of got the ball rolling. So why don't you start the conversation?
Well, this term hyperinflation, what does it actually mean? When we talk about an inflating a currency, it means that you have to use more currency, more dollars to buy the same thing. So if gas was $1, now it's $2. Well, that's of course a devaluation of the currency by 50%. The dollar is only worth half of what it was worth before. Okay, that's pretty dramatic. But what happens if month by month? What happens is it's a gas is $2, and then 3 months later it's $3, and then a few months later it's $5 or $6. Well, I'm only giving that as an example of an accelerating rate. So what occurs in hyperinflation is that you have an increase of the rate of increase of inflation. So in other words, let's say that if over a year the price of gas doubles, but then over the period of the next 6 months it doubles again, then that means that you've doubled the rate of increase of the rate. So you've gone from $1 to $2 to $4, and you've done that in less time. Each time the doubling is taking less time. That's just a crude example, but it's a good example. And what we're looking at worldwide now, particularly since the beginning of this year, let's say the February period, you look at what's happened with the price of gasoline or oil, especially if you're in Europe, where the Europeans keep complaining, their prices are actually now 4 times or 5 times what the prices are in the United States. But in the United States, people seem to experience initially an increase. Now it seems to be a little bit down. So in America, people sort of think, well, it's not as bad. But wait, then you find out the overall rate of inflation is something like 9, 10, 11%, acknowledged rate. But then again, you go into the supermarket and your experience there is right? And people are just saying, wait a minute, think I'm paying $5 for 2 grapefruit. How is this, right? So probably the best way for us to think about how people should think about this is, instead of trying to come up with, let's say, a theory or mathematics or figures, just think about the experience of the instability that creeps into life, where now you can, for example, go to one gas station where the price of regular gasoline will say $2.97. And then you can go half a mile away and it will say $3.57. Exact same gasoline. Right? And the price is that different, even though you only went to a mile and a half or whatever it is. This is what we're saying. There's no regulation to life. There's an instability. There's a destabilization. There's a degradation of it. That's the process. And we'll get to the war part, but I just wanted to first establish that. Diane probably has some things to add in terms of what she sees about this.
Diane?
Well, I'm thinking about what they're doing with the interest rates, right? Because we heard that we have to raise the interest rates in order to stop inflation. Somehow that's supposed to work. But what does that mean? It means that the interest rates on loans are higher. So people can't borrow the money, and the amount of money they owe has increased by large amounts, 20%, 50%, the amount you have to repay. Or take people's credit cards. Now you have interest rates of 29%.
Oh,
there was a time when that was against the law. So what they're claiming to be doing in the name of stopping inflation is actually causing more inflation. And what it is doing, as everyone knows and feels it, who's not a multimillionaire or billionaire, is it's looting the population. And this process actually began some time ago. There were 2 major policy changes that put us in the position where we could be today. There were others, but very significant. One was warned about by Lyndon LaRouche in 1971, which is that Nixon was going to get rid of the Bretton Woods system by decoupling the dollar from the gold reserve system under pressure from the UK and what had happened there, and also George Shultz, I understand. But at any rate, so that suddenly meant that you had floating exchange rates, that you were shifting from the idea of value of something in the physical real world upon which people depended for their livelihood, whether it was food or fuel or healthcare or something semi-tangible, to merely speculation, which always leads to inflation, hyperinflation. And then you had in 1999, under Bill Clinton at the urging of Alan Greenspan and others, the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, so that you no longer had the firewall of protection between the speculators and the normal savings and loans. So between those two things and many other various deregulatory measures that were taken, you left the middle class totally vulnerable to be raped and looted by the financier class, which unfortunately seems to largely be what our Congress is made up of.
Let me ask you a question. One issue that I've been looking at for many years is the student loan debt crisis. And over the years, the interest rates, there's over 40 million people that have been that are subjected to this. And, it seems like when they default on their loans and they can't pay their loans, then they're subjected to higher interest rates. So the hyperinflation is going to add to the misery of people who still owe money because of their college loans, right?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay.
And why is the tuition so much? Speaking about hyperinflation, I mean, how come it costs more to go to school for a semester than to buy a new car? Or you could buy 2 houses with 4 years of tuition. I mean, that is really bizarre. And the houses are overinflated too. So what you're seeing again is what the powers that be, what they consider of value, which is merely the inflation of the bubble, versus what is real value, which is the question of the standard of living in your population. Because after all, we invented the economy. We are not an appendage. We feel like that we're an appendage of some banking system, but we could change all of it at will.
Dennis?
If you take, for example, this issue of the student debt, it now costs, for example, I went to the college, Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania. When I went, I was a full scholarship student. It meant that all of my expenses were paid, as in all of my expenses. I didn't have to pay for books. I didn't have to pay any other thing. It was about $5,250 a year. That school now costs $56,000. Again, 10 times what it would cost me, what in the same way that we talked about the military budget. Well, then maybe there's a reason that students who are going to the schools are nihilistic. Maybe there's a reason they're depressed. For example, if you go to Harvard for 4 years now, the estimate is that the total cost for that 4-year education are about $321,000. Okay. Now, what kind of education is that? If that's the price of getting a premier or supposedly a very good education, what does it mean about public education? What are we saying that we are? And there's another element here. Perhaps the purpose of the student is that the student represents an asset, a debt instrument. Maybe what we've actually done is something like what was done in the novel written by the Ukrainian-Russian novelist Nikolai Gogol called Dead Souls. And the idea is that there's a whole lot of, there are peasants in Russia, and they are each monetized for a certain value. So what happens is when they die, what happens is that their deaths are hidden so that they still count on the books for the value that is assigned to each one of them. If you look at the thing with respect to the students, each of the students is essentially simply a debt. And the purpose of college has become to indebt the students. The purpose is not to turn out people who have any kind of actual education. It's to be able to collateralize debt. And so the idea here is that you have a dehumanization process, which hyperinflation very specifically encourages. If you look at Germany, which is the classic example of this, in which literally the prices of goods would change between the time that you left the house and you arrived at a store. And of course, there's the famous case of the people taking a wheelbarrow worth of currency to the store to buy a loaf of bread. But it actually reached the point that it didn't matter how much you started out with, whatever you thought the price was at 8 o'clock in the morning, by the time you got to where you were going at 9:30, it was different. Because no longer was production, no longer was the individual, no longer was the social process of cohesion of the society. That was no longer primary. It was the maintenance of of this false debt, which was simply accumulating as a monetary feature. It had nothing to do with physical production, nothing to do with creativity, nothing to do with maintaining people. That's what we have adopted in the United States, particularly since the shutting down of the Glass-Steagall Act, but specifically also more generally from the time of August 15th of 1971. These policies can be reversed, they can be thrown out, but there seems to be no political will to do that at the moment.
Diane?
Well, I really appreciate the point Dennis just made about people being turned from people into collateral. I think that's really true. You see a horrific dehumanization, and getting back to Zelensky's visit, the idea that he could stand there talking about how Ukraine is winning when you know the human suffering is beyond imagination, but that's not considered important by these people. So there's a real separation between reality of human existence and human immortality, I will say, because what is the point of our existence? It's not just the little sliver of time that we're here in the scope of, I don't know, 5 billion years that the planet has been here, but people make contributions, right? Einstein made incredible contributions to science. Beethoven made incredible contributions to music. We lose that if we lose what humanity actually is. And how do you put a monetary value on a contribution like Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, which was premiered today in Vienna? There's not. So the things that are actually enduring and are the most important for human beings are degraded and destroyed for something that ultimately is ephemeral, which is this amount of money and power. So it's a very destructive, anti-human policy, and the perpetrators of it, for some reason, some of which may be their own personal lifestyle habits and drug use, and I don't know what else, seem to not be that concerned about.
I shop at the food co-op in Albany, and I do member hours for a discount. And when I do member hours, I see the amount of money people are spending over the holidays on food. I see people walking out with bills of $300 or more. How could this be sustained? I mean, it's ridiculous. The price of food is terrible. I'd like your opinion.
Well, if you look at also the price of the production of food, and in fact, the farmers of the United States, roughly half of the farmers that are still farming in the United States can't make a living farming. They have additional jobs that they have to take just to maintain their farms. Now, that's not because they're incompetent as farmers. It's because of the price of production in terms of purchase of new equipment, the problem that Diane brought up a few minutes ago concerning the issue of interest rates, the inability to buy things on credit. Obviously, there's another element, which is because of the cartelization of food production, and the fact you have these massive farms, the individual owner-operated farm, the family farmer, has been rendered almost obsolete in the United States. So when you're looking at this issue of food in particular, then there's the issue of the quality of the food, the fact that you're importing apples from someplace overseas as opposed to all the apples you have in New York State, or other things like that. But the issue, I think, way to think about it is that it's the control over the people that is expressed in the use of food as a weapon. The idea of the cartelization of food supplies, as is true also of energy, oil, natural gas, the notion of trying to grab or to create circumstances of scarcity, which you see is important to look at also in terms of the idea that with respect to the hyperinflation, we talked about this issue of war, that is the driving force to war. Take, for example, the issue here of Ukraine. We talked about Ukraine already. Ukraine was already, of course, one of the most corrupt countries in the world, but it was the center of the whole digital currency so-called revolution. This isn't because Ukraine doesn't have great resources. It has tremendous resources from the standpoint of agricultural power, and it had tremendous scientific resources as well. But what was happening is that Ukraine was being used as an entry point to try to extend the hyperinflated system of the transatlantic sector into Russia and into China. The Western system is bankrupt. It has been bankrupt. It does not produce its own, it doesn't have much physical productivity. If you look at the American workforce, which in 1966, was about 52% was in physical production, plant and equipment and in agriculture, mining, manufacturing, that's what it was. Now, approximately 16% at best of our economy is in that field. So we no longer sustain ourselves. And many of the countries of the transatlantic don't sustain themselves. They have this massive, maybe as much as $2 quadrillion worth of paper that will never be paid back. And a lot of it is also digital now. It's not even paper. So you don't even have, it's not even physical paper. You've gotten so far away, in other words, from reality into this thing that people blithely call virtual reality, that the financial world of the West is virtual reality. Now, whether it's Russia, whether it's China, whether it's Brazil, whether it's countries in South America or Africa that can't afford to do that, and they can't afford to go along with things like the Green New Deal or things like that, or whether simply people here in America who, like you say, go to the supermarket and now you're spending $300 that you don't have. You're putting on credit cards, right? And you don't really know where it's coming from. And then you got the question of what you're going to have to spend medically, where we don't even know what our situation is medically. So it's unsustainable. The situation is unsustainable. And so where war comes in, and this is the issue of Zelensky's appearance last night, is that you're proposing to a very elite, if you will, and very protected segment of the American military establishment. Let's go to war, because that will be profitable for you. We must commit the people to that. Therefore, we must commit the people to looting themselves, to less food, to less availability for energy, higher prices. So the inflation is being supposedly patriotically linked to maintaining not merely Ukraine or something, maintaining the debt structure with this $1 to $2 quadrillion that you and I did not accumulate. This was accumulated by speculators, but you and I will pay for. And so the issue in our time is that people have got to wake up and realize, returning to some of the things that Franklin Roosevelt did, for example, with Glass-Steagall, that separating out speculation from actual direct investment in the country and in the people, that the people come first. That's what we have to do. And it can be done. Now, I don't see that in the present administration. I don't really see that in the present Congress. It is something that we have to cause as the American people to come back into prominence. I think that's why Diane, when she ran as an independent candidate, and she's now doing it again, her whole point was to try to, get people back to basics, to Hamilton's economics. Hamilton, of course, being New York, New York's representative to the Constitution and the first treasurer of the United States. And he had a very, very clear, very good basic program. And that's the thing that we have to return this nation to.
Diane?
Well, I think on the war question, you see, we've imposed all these sanctions, and the United States has sanctions on, I forget how many nations, dozens of them. But with regard to Russia, and you see, they had to make peculiar exceptions where it would make certain things absolutely impossible, but they didn't care about things that go into making fertilizer, for example, which caused the price to explode. When I was traveling in upstate New York, I stopped at just a gas station deli and was talking to some people about my campaign, and they were all farmers. And they were telling me that the cost of fertilizing their fields had become completely out of control, and they knew colleagues who actually had to give up producing one kind of crop and switch to something else because they simply could not afford to fertilize their field because of the sanctions policy. So another way of creating hyperinflation and looting is to create scarcity. And that is definitely a policy. In terms of the United States, I mean, New York has some real stinkers and we have some geniuses. So as Dennis mentioned, Alexander Hamilton, who really did understand the driver of wealth being human invention, human creativity, which was echoed by Lincoln. And then you even had what Franklin Roosevelt did, who couldn't get rid of the Federal Reserve, but he figured out how to use the Reconstruction Finance Organization to actually issue credit to get millions of people working, build thousands of schools, thousands of hospitals. And the point is, how do you actually stop inflation? You have to increase productivity. You have to increase the physical, real, tangible goods that are connected to the so-called money that you're producing.
We could talk forever. This is a problem that's not going to go away tomorrow. And
unfortunately,
I'm not exactly well versed on this stuff that you're talking about. So let me close with this. What are your final thoughts, Diane? Is there anything else that should be added to this conversation?
Well, what I would like people to remember is that the suffering is in effect arbitrary. Again, as FDR said when he came in office, this is not, we haven't been stricken by a plague of locusts. It wasn't a tornado. We didn't get hit by an asteroid. What is happening to people on the planet is a result of our own doing. And it's a result of the action or inaction by those people that are sworn to uphold, in the case of the United States, the Constitution and represent us. And therefore, while it's not likely that this is going to change tomorrow, it could change tomorrow. And I think that people really have to have in mind what our nation should be and to fight for that and nothing less than that, and not what we think is possible under the circumstances, because we'll never get what we need. So I'd like to leave it at that. This doesn't have to be going on. It could be changed virtually instantaneously, and we should not tolerate it.
Dennis, final thoughts? Have I touched on everything that should be talked about?
I think you have. I think the thing that we might want to say to people in New York, where Diane is a candidate, is that it used to be called the Empire States because it's about, I don't remember if the size of merely West Germany or the entirety of Germany, but I will say this, that because of the Hudson River in particular, when it was founded, when it was begun in the period of, I'm talking here about the constitutional period, 1789 and after, that it was assumed that it was the gateway to the West. It was assumed that it was primarily a port and export center, and it was going to be an industrial center and an agricultural center. I mean, people don't even know this. For example, Brooklyn used to produce food for Haiti. It was a food center because Haiti was actually the center of the French colonial world. It was extraordinarily rich, both in various products that came out of there and minerals and so on. So the area of New York has everything that one would need. And then, of course, there's also the fact of the population concentrations around New York City, the skill levels. Over 700 languages are spoken in New York City. So that the possibilities are that if you simply had a mobilized citizenry that, for example, said, you know, we saw what Mr. Zelensky had to say, and we reject this idea that the United States is going to become the cockboat in the wake of a British man of war. That is to say that British and other people who think you've got to somehow put through this war with Russia, which has never, frankly, has never attacked the United States. So we could reverse the policy. We could take a different track altogether. And in that regard, Franklin Roosevelt was from New York. Hamilton was the representative of the New York State to the country. Those two examples alone. And Bobby Kennedy, let's remember, was even a senator from New York. So you can claim even the Kennedys. So if you take Roosevelt, Hamilton, and Kennedy, and you take what Diane is doing, that is the appropriate, shall we say, intellectual identification that people ought to have with solving these problems of hyperinflation. Yes, they may come from Wall Street, but on the other hand, that's where Washington was inaugurated. That's where Hamilton worked. That's where he lived. So it's up to us as to which one of those traditions we want to identify with and manifest in the daily lives of Americans and in New Yorkers in particular.
Well, we shall continue this conversation. We live in very interesting times. So I'm Cynthia Pooler. You've been listening to Diane Sare and Dennis Speed. You guys have a wonderful holiday season. And thank you, everybody, for listening. And please, if you like this show, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Diane and Dennis, thank you so much. We'll talk soon.
Thank you.